we see in the New Testament Jesus talking about the Pharisees, the Sadducees, but in the Old Testament, you don't see any Pharisees, you don't see any Sadducees, you don't see any rabbis. So none of that is in the Old Testament. But it's all through the New Testament. So it's like, okay, well, there's a gap. Where what happened? Where's the big change? So the big change was after they got last captivity by Babylon and the temple got destroyed, a lot changed in the Jewish religion. So what happened was, they destroyed the temple. So the Jewish religion was based on temple worship. You had to sacrifice in the temple. You go to the temple, the high priests are in the temple. So now they didn't have a temple. So like the whole religion was kind of like, well, how do we do it? We don't have a temple. So the Pharisees came up with a way to do the religion outside of the temple.
Okay.
So they came up with a way to kind of save Judaism. So they came up with a way to save that you could practice and do things without a temple. So it's just about focused on the law, the books of the law. So you don't need a temple, you just need the law. But they didn't stop there. They said, okay, well, we got the law, but in addition to the law, we have this written law from Moses, but now we have oral law. So they believe that Moses didn't just get these, 10 commandments or 613 Jewish laws. He got a bunch of other commands, but they just weren't written down. So they've been passed along verbally. So they had oral laws, and so the Pharisees were keepers of these oral laws, which were additional things. And so they're the ones who had rabbis. They introduced the rabbis, and they believed that a Messiah was going to come. They believed in resurrection of the dead for a judgment day. And they're kind of the parent of current day Judaism. So the rabbinic system of the Pharisees is kind of where the current Judaism came from. So then we have the Sadducees. Sadducees were the other sect that's talked about in the New Testament. And they believed in the temple worship. So when the temple got rebuilt, they came and they were like, well, no, we need to get back to the temple worship. And all of these oral traditions, we don't believe in those. We just believe in the 5 books of Moses. All this temple worship is not, we need to temple worship. All these oral traditions are not really inspired by God. And they were kind of the upper class. They were aristocratic. They were rich. They were politically connected. So they were kind of they're in cahoots with the Roman government. They were politically, and so they were kind of high class, the Sadducees, and they didn't believe in a Messiah. They didn't believe there was a Messiah coming. And they didn't believe in a resurrection of the dead. So they believed that all your rewards and punishment happen while you're living. There's no afterlife. All your rewards and punishment. So the Pharisees felt that these traditions weren't just something they came up with. They claimed that these traditions were given to Moses on Mount Sinai, orally, and they were passed down from generation to generation in an unbroken line. And so these traditions are oral, so they call them oral traditions, and if they're just as important as the written traditions. But the other sects, the Sadducees, didn't agree with that. But so they're saying these oral traditions. So they had oral traditions and so the oral traditions, so they had a lot of oral traditions. The oral traditions like, the law says you can't work on the Sabbath. So the oral traditions clarify, well, what does that mean? The law says what to eat. But there were no chickens around in Moses' days. So the oral traditions, they talk about, can you eat chicken? So and then it has stuff about understanding the spirit realm. The roles of angels, the names of angels. They weren't mentioned in the law, but that was in their oral tradition. The function of the devil was in their oral tradition. The resurrection of the dead was in their oral tradition. And so, for example, on the Sabbath, it says you can't do work on the Sabbath. So the thought was, if you cooked something before the Sabbath, you had to cook it before the Sabbath, and you could eat it on the Sabbath. If you have food, you can't bring food from outside and eat it. So they had a tradition that said, and you can't bring food from outside and eat it, because that'll be work. So they had tradition that said, well, if you have a basket of fruit, you can set it in the doorway, so it's half inside and half outside. And now you can eat it if you're inside or outside. so, so that was a tradition. So you can't work. So women couldn't wear jewelry that was made, that they bought, because that was their job to sell the jewelry. But if they had jewelry that was made by an unprofessional, unskilled person, they could wear that, because it wasn't any work involved. So those were type of traditions they have. And so the law said, give thanks before you eat. So the traditions had specific ritualistic prayers that you say. And so it's like the law says give thanks, but the traditions have, okay, this is the prayer you have to say. This is the specific way you give thanks. On this day you say this way, on this day that. So they had specific traditions that they felt were just as weighty. So we see Jesus was in odds with the Pharisees and Sadducees and the scribes. And they were the main people opposing him. And as we talked about, he wasn't really going against sinners. And so, but we see that they accused Jesus of breaking the law. And so that used to be kind of a thing I would wonder about. It's like, well, wait, is Jesus? Because they would say, hey, you're breaking the law. And Jesus would say, this law is not important because of this and this. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. Jesus is saying we don't need to follow the law. It's like, well, is Jesus saying, the law is not important? But then elsewhere, he's like, well, I didn't come to change any of the law. It's like, well, wait a minute now. Which one is it? You're breaking the law. You didn't come to change the law. But it's the oral law that he's opposed to. So, because he says that he didn't come to change any of the Mosaic law. Because that was kind of confusing. He's breaking the law, but yet he said he didn't come to change any law. It's like, well, wait a minute, but it's a different law. It's the oral law. So Jesus wasn't against the law. He disagreed with their interpretation of the law. He disagreed with their traditions that they've added to the law. And he said elsewhere that their traditions made the law of no effect. So Jesus wasn't against the law. Jesus wasn't saying we don't have to follow the law anymore.
Yes, so verse 19, Jesus said that whoever relaxes one of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. So they'll be in the kingdom of heaven, right?
They'll be in the kingdom of heaven, yeah.
Okay. So then, what did the Pharisees do then? Like, they must be doing something
worse than relaxing.
than relaxing the law.
Yeah, so that's what we're gonna look at. What else were they doing bad? See, so Jesus wasn't against the Pharisees because they were legalistic about the Torah or the law. He was against them because they had laws and traditions that were in opposition to the Torah. Jesus didn't call regular sinners sons of the devil or snakes or vipers. Jesus rarely spoke harshly about sinners. He forgave them. Jesus spoke harshly about the Pharisees, Sadducees, and scribes, the religious leaders who, one, didn't accept Jesus as the Messiah, and two, prevented other people from entering the kingdom of God. They act and talk like they're of God, but they are counterfeits. Jesus said, beware of the wolf in sheep's clothing. Revelations 2:8-9 says, to the angel of the church of Smyrna write, these are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. So there are people who claim to be Jews, but are not. In the same way, there are people who claim to be Christians, but are not, but are a synagogue of Satan.